Floyd Patterson was an absolute monster in the ring, using his dynamic footwork, crafty boxing, and incredible speed to destroy the competition. He rose through the ranks at a ridiculous pace, taking the heavyweight championship at only 21 years old. Patterson's coach was the great Cus D'Amato, who taught him the same peekaboo boxing style he would later teach Mike Tyson. Peekaboo fighters look to square up with their opponents, placing both themselves and their competitors into the most dangerous position possible. Both Tyson and Patterson counted on side-to-side head movement to keep themselves safe in this open, high-risk position, while at the same time, they looked to take advantage of their opponent's equally vulnerable position. But Patterson was his own unique fighter, with several fundamental differences in how he approached peekaboo boxing in comparison to Tyson. Patterson lacked the same power that Tyson would one day become known for, but he made up for that with insane, mind-boggling speed. While Ali is widely considered the fastest heavyweight champion overall, most would argue that Patterson had the faster hands. Patterson threw blisteringly fast combinations. By the time an opponent had noticed his first punch, the second had already landed, and this gave Patterson some pretty unique advantages. For instance, like Tyson, Patterson loved to aim low to tempt an opponent to drop their guard, then attack high to take advantage of the new opening his first punch had created. But unlike Tyson, Patterson would often target the same spot with the same hand multiple times. When doubling up, it's difficult to put any power into the second punch in general. Moving from low to high or high to low can help a little bit by giving the second punch more distance to build up speed. But since Patterson was punching the same target over and over again, he didn't even have that. But it didn't matter. He was so fast that he could still break through. Since effective blocking entails tensing and resisting in time with an opponent's punches, Patterson's insane combination speed made it near impossible to maintain a stable guard. Opponents simply couldn't keep up with Patterson's rhythm. And since no guard is ever completely devoid of openings, Patterson's hand speed meant he could cut through the cracks in an opponent's armor with ease. Like Holyfield against Foreman, Patterson's quick combinations helped him to break through even the normally frustrating crossguard with little difficulty. Patterson's hand speed also helped tremendously while infighting. A common tactic at close range is to protect your head on an opponent's shoulder. Building on this, another tactic is to suddenly disengage, then take advantage of the small gap your head was occupying to land a punch. Opponents expect this and can usually defend it, but Patterson was so fast, his punch could usually get there before opponents even had time to react. In fact, Patterson worked moving on and off of an opponent's shoulder into his head movement. Something not uncommon, but exceptionally difficult to do. This kept Patterson safe at close range, taking away any reach advantage the opponent might have had, and positioning Patterson close enough to take advantage of his superior speed. Another huge difference between Tyson and Patterson was the way they used the unique footwork of Cus D'Amato's style. The high-risk, squared-up position used by peekaboo-style boxers helps them to move to either side in either stance, opening up a plethora of new angles that more traditionally minded boxers don't enjoy. While Tyson used the multi-angled, multi-stance philosophy of peekaboo style almost exclusively to cut off the ring and chase opponents to the ropes, Patterson used it to box. In this way, it can be argued that Patterson used a less focused, but more complete version of the peekaboo style than Tyson. Although Patterson could pressure, he was great at circling the ring, skillfully moving in and out of range at all angles to bait opponents into his attacks. For instance, rather than enter into a neutral position right away, Patterson would often stay sideways and box more traditionally until the right moment presented itself. When circling at long range, Patterson preferred to close the distance by slipping outside while stepping inside. This position both closed the distance and provided the maximum amount of safety for Patterson, as his crouch closed off his body and hid his head outside of his opponent's jab. More importantly, this position hid much of Patterson's body from his opponent's view. This meant that he could weave up from underneath an opponent's jab when they least expected it, loading up his signature Gazelle hook. Patterson was a big fan of shuffling into his hooks, a risky move that nonetheless added insane power to Patterson's punch. At times, Patterson threw himself halfway across the ring to connect with his opponent's chin. But although this was Patterson's flashiest weapon to employ once he closed the distance, he had many others. For instance, Patterson loved to shuffle outside mid-combination in order to gain a tempo on his opponent. This is a similar concept to chess, where you can check an opponent to force them to waste a move defending it. By moving outside, Patterson forced an opponent to waste a move pivoting to face him, and while they lagged one step behind, Patterson could set up his next punch. This was usually either a lead uppercut or a right hook, both thrown from an angle where the opponent could not see due to their inferior position. Patterson could also use the same concept to circle inside, at times ending up behind his opponent. This linear shift put both Patterson and his opponent into a southpaw position, where Patterson was comfortable and his opponent was not. But as you might have guessed, approaching from a traditional stance and then transitioning to a more squared up stance mid-combination was only a small part of Patterson's repertoire. One of the things that made Patterson so difficult to deal with was how he constantly stepped into and out of his squared up stance, moving in and out of range to bait and confuse competitors. Pay attention to how Patterson constantly plays with moving his lead foot from close to his opponent's lead foot, the standard more closed off position, to deeper inside, a far riskier position for either fighter. Like the great Salvador Sanchez, Patterson loved to crouch as he did this, at times ducking as he stepped in, and at times when he stepped back out. This was extremely frustrating for Patterson's opponents, because for them, Patterson's head movement was considered a threat all on its own. Each time Patterson moved his head offline, he loaded one hand with more potential power by shifting his weight to that side. So when Patterson crouched, he was both making his opponent miss, which is a huge drain on energy, and threatening to set up powerful punches from new angles. Patterson's head movement and footwork complemented each other perfectly in this, setting up great angles for his lead hooks by flanking his opponent to the inside. This forward aggression would later prove very effective for Mike Tyson as well. But unlike Tyson, Patterson would also step back into a more neutral stance, many times after goading a punch intentionally. This let him step off to either angle and rebound right back to counter from a number of different positions, with either hand. This was very reminiscent of Willie Pep. The ability to suddenly and subtly transition from defense to aggression was a big part of what made Patterson such a dangerous fighter. He could go from circling and probing to suddenly charging forward, piling on insane pressure. For instance, when opponents tried to pivot away, Patterson would stay put rather than pivot with them, instead following them from southpaw. This is known as a turn shift, and is a major advantage for multi-stance fighters. But of course, Patterson could use this same principle while moving back as well. If opponents tried to pressure forward, Patterson would many times shift into southpaw to take advantage of the superior outside foot position. This was fantastic for landing lead right hooks. It should be clear by now that Patterson possessed near complete freedom of movement and was able to attack moving backwards, forwards, or laterally from any range with either hand. Patterson was truly a complete peekaboo boxing artist. Before wrapping up, it's best to mention two pretty unique elements of Patterson's style that helped to glue the whole thing together. These allowed him to enjoy his high mobility, narrow sideways stance, as well as his deep, wide squared up stance. Because, like Ricardo Lopez, Patterson could transition from fancy footwork in a high mobility stance to power punching in a low, broader stance. And he did this using a split step. The split step allows a fighter to drop down from a narrow stance by jumping up and rapidly spreading his legs into a wider stance. What's amazing is that Patterson would do this laterally as well, dropping from a sideways stance into a squared up stance. Another consideration is that because Patterson kept a more narrow stance much of the time, he tended to bend at the waist like Frazier, rather than sink down by bending his knees as Tyson preferred to do. While this can create more angles for head movement, it can also exact a large toll. Patterson was troubled by a bad back during the later part of his career, and sometimes it could go out mid-fight. So use caution if you choose to experiment with Patterson's version of the Peekaboo. Patterson was one of the most entertaining fighters to ever enter the ring, and I recommend anyone interested in Peekaboo boxing to watch all of his fights and compare and contrast his style with Tyson's. This can help you to better figure out your own unique skills and attributes. You can also check out my books on footwork, defense, and power for more info. From the Modern Martial Artist, this has been David Christian, wishing you happy training.